Okay, hi everybody. Everyone has hushed into awkward silence, so we can begin. Hello everyone, and my name is Paul Brandon. I'm the director of the CSRS, and welcome to our Scholars in the Square lecture series. You're about to hear a 20-minute presentation, 20 minutes of interaction with carefully chosen conversational partners, and then 20 minutes of discussion with the broader public, including about 20 people in the room. I'm really pleased to say today that we have Jordan Stanger-Ross, who has been chosen as our interlocutor or conversational partner for the second 20-minute chunk of the experience. I also want to say that I think this format's worked really quite well, and I want to thank Rachel, Scott, Noriko, and Dee for making it all work. Our speaker for today is Megan Hollinger. Megan is a graduate student fellow at the CSRS this year. She's in the fourth year of her Religious Studies PhD program at the University of Ottawa. Prior to her PhD, she completed an MA also in Religious Studies and also at the University of Ottawa, where she addressed court cases dealing with anti-Semitism. Her talk this afternoon grows out of her project, which is entitled Same Problem, Alternative Approaches, Combating Anti-Semitism in Contemporary Canada. In her work, she explores community-based solutions for combating anti-Semitism that move beyond the law. Now, in addition to being here working on her dissertation, she is also part of the massive Non-Religion in a Complex Future project at the University of Ottawa. Both the NCF and Megan's PhD work are supervised by Laurie Beeman. Laurie Beeman is someone who's quite well familiar with the CSRS and many folks in the room. We're delighted that our partnership with Laurie's project on non-religion means that we get to meet lots of interesting junior and senior colleagues working on issues that are both of interest to scholars and the broader public. Now, I'm aware that Megan is about to address issues that many of us will find quite troubling. I don't say this as a trigger warning exactly, but just so we name the feeling before we feel the feeling. If you do feel the need to step out at any time during her talk, please go ahead. Now, we did not intentionally schedule this talk during the Truth and Reconciliation Week here at UVic, but this coincidence might nonetheless heighten our awareness of the dark forces that show up often through history and around the world. And so let me end my introductory remarks by saying that we acknowledge and respect the Musqueam peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Salish peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. And now, over to Megan.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for joining in person and on the Zoom. So the title of my talk today is Creating Contact, Bridging Divides, and it's going to look at an overview of what I'm doing in my project. I'm conducting field work, so interviews with research subjects in 3 cities, and thus far I have data from my participants in Ottawa, and I'm just starting to collect in Victoria, and I'll be doing Montreal in the winter. And so I haven't reached the part of the project where I've fully coded the data from Ottawa yet or completed the data collection. So what I'm showing, it's not going to be findings, but I really want to talk about the kind of strategies I'm looking at and give you some background as to why I argue they're appropriate for combating anti-Semitism in Canada and why we should be shifting our focus to these kinds of strategies. So I'm going to start. I want to thank funding for the project. It's made possible, and support for the project is made possible by SSHRC, the Government of Ontario, University of Ottawa, and the Centre for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. So thank you very much to all. So I just want to start with 3 images or quotes. These are taken from B'nai B'rith Canada's 2022 annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. It's a yearly report that reports on the stats on anti-Semitism in Canada. And I tried to choose the images based on incidents that happened last year in the communities that I worked in or will be working in. So here we have an Ottawa area physician who's received anti-Semitic threats and voicemails. She had been very outspoken about issues in the community, particularly vaccination. So calling her the K word, which is an offensive term towards Jews. This was an email message received by to the committee of the Victoria International Jewish Film Festival last year, a bomb threat that, to the festival and to those attending the festival. I'll just leave it up for a second if you wanted to read it.
Look who sent it.
Yes, and the person sent it under the name Jesus Christ. And the email was zionistbodyparts@jew.org. So we won't get into the complex topic in this talk about anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, where does the line get drawn That's very messy and complicated and not really what I'm here to talk about. So, but it's just an idea of sometimes how the rhetoric gets mixed up. And lastly, for Montreal, this was on Israel Day, or a rally. Someone was holding an Israeli flag but was assaulted by being hit in the head with a stick. So it's more the physical assaults. I mean, this can be looked at as a crime of, against Jews. It could be looked at as a crime based on nationality, political views, etc. But it's the assault that I wanted to note. Okay, so before I talk about the research questions, I want to mention why I'm looking at social and community strategies generally. In my master's work, I looked at legal strategies for combating anti-Semitism because when I started, you look at a lot of people and even state actors and different stakeholders in the fight on hate and anti-Semitism. And one of the common responses is to turn to legislation or political responses, the law, policy, etc. But the amount of hate crimes and incidents against Jews is increasing all the time. And so my question was, well, if this is what we keep talking about, like this is the common discourse about combating anti-Semitism, maybe something's not working or working to the extent we need it to work quick enough to make real change. And so I evaluated court cases, and what I found were various shortcomings in these responses. And I looked at in the court cases, because that's a recording of an actual legal response to an anti-Semitic crime, hate crime. And I found that there were shortcomings and several issues with the legal responses that I argue prevented it from being a solution that we should make our main strategy. So I think it should be a tool. The law, the Criminal Code of Canada is very important. We need it. It has a place, a function in the fight against anti-Semitism, but perhaps moving it to a tool, not the main focus. And then I said, well, what should be the focus? And I thought, well, we're seeing anti-Semitism coming in interactions between people, organizations to people. It's in the social sphere, the social arena. And so I thought, why are we not looking at strategies that target social relations and social interactions between people? And thus brought me to what I'm doing now. So I looked into the literature on the psychology of prejudice. And there's been much research on combating prejudice. And a lot of it focuses on exactly what I was questioning and saying, well, maybe we should go in that direction for this kind of hate. And it looks at, a lot of it is contact between different communities and groups. So it's called intergroup contact. So I'll get to that in a moment. But really what I want to know with my research, first, what are some effective strategies that combat anti-Semitism here in Canada and that move outside the scope of law? What are some strategies that have made a positive difference for Jewish communities? And what are people doing on the ground every day in everyday interactions to promote inclusion, navigate diversity, and foster positive interaction between Jewish and non-Jewish communities in Canada? And can we adapt these strategies more broadly for farther reaching and deeper action and change? I wanted to know as well, I started out wanting to know, will these strategies and initiatives be effective to reduce anti-Semitism in terms of hate crimes and I guess hopefully over the long term attitudes towards Jews? And how can we measure the efficacy of these efforts? I think as I've gone through some of the research, some of these questions have moved maybe to a more backseat position or aren't as relevant or quote unquote answerable as I originally thought that they would be, but that's okay. We're still looking at strategies that target diversity and social relations. So the goals of the project are to identify which solutions have worked effectively to combat anti-Semitism and foster more positive relations between Jews and non-Jews, to determine whether these can and should be broadened for wider reaching action, and to develop a toolkit of diverse and nuanced strategies, including strengthened legal ones, to combat the many types of anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Jewish hate that exist. There are many types of anti-Jewish hate. It's existed for a very long time. I think of it as a tree. The trunk is the theme of anti-Jewish hate, and the branches are the different manifestations and ways that Jews can be targeted, the different parts of their identity have been or can be targeted. And I like that because it shows that there's difference in the, each kind of anti-Jewish hate is contextually unique and has unique origins, but there's interconnectedness between the different kinds of hatred against Jews. So my research locations, I think for time's sake, I won't go into the justifications for all of them, but you're welcome to ask me after. I chose 3 locations to conduct interviews in to decide or to see what are people doing and what do they think is effective about those strategies. So Ottawa is the first one. I'm here in Victoria now, the second. And like I said, Montreal will be next. Montreal, I will note though, one of the main reasons for choosing Montreal is because of the unique context of anti-Semitism and Jewish and non-Jewish relations in the province of Quebec. And most of the Jewish community in Quebec lives in Montreal. So that was a really important location just contextually to see what was going on there and what was being done, because they have certain political, social, cultural factors both now and historically that make the situation a little different there. So this is the main part of my talk, and the reason I want to talk about some of the work in the psychology of prejudice is because I think even though I've given a justification for why are we looking at these types of strategies, here's why and what the research says about why they might be effective. So the psychology of prejudice, there's early works, but the main early work that's so influential, it was originally published in 1954 and is still cited today and influences a lot of the social psychological work that built off of his work, is that of Gordon Allport. His book, The Nature of Prejudice, was seminal in the field of understanding and combating prejudice. And he is an early positor and the main positor of contact theory, which is the theory that posits that groups who have, and I will put the caveat in, of structured, intentional, and mediated contact, that contact does have the potential to reduce prejudice in those groups towards each other. So the in-group would be your group, and the out-group would be the group that you are prejudiced against or have biases against. He has a very helpful definition of prejudice, and kind of like anti-Semitism or religion, it's a very hard term to actually define. So I'll read out his definition. So he defines prejudice, ethnic prejudice, as an antipathy based on a faulty and inflexible generalization. It may be felt or expressed. It may be directed towards a group as a whole, or individual, or toward an individual because he's a member of that group. So again, that's not necessarily a definition all people use, but it does form the basis for more contemporary definitions. But either way, Gordon Allport really worked on the prejudiced personality. Why do people hate? Why do people not hate? What could work about intergroup contact? And he decided there are 5 stages of prejudice and discrimination, and he labels them as anti-locution, avoidance, discrimination, physical attack, and extermination. So even in the history of anti-Semitism, we've seen it manifest in all of those ways at different times. So then you get into the work on conspiracy theory, scapegoating, and stereotyping, because the problem and one of the challenges to combating anti-Semitism is so much of the hate centers around or is underlined by conspiracies, stereotypes, and the action of scapegoating. I like to think of the 3 of them as intertwined, and they're kind of playmates. They like to play around together. They depend on each other, right? Scapegoating can't necessarily happen without conspiracy theories and stereotypes existing about a certain group. However, they all function on the way of largely on the ideas of perceived threat of an outgroup, and perhaps in times of crises when you're searching for someone to blame, in-groups or the group doing the blaming can, based on preconceived notions and prejudices about an outgroup, create the ability to scapegoat, because these processes are already, and discourses already circulate in society. So the problem is that conspiracy theories in particular rest on certain cognitive processes and certain very, very, very core values to people and core ideas and thought processes. And so it's really hard to target just through contact how, the underlying processes that actually cause people to think conspiratorially. And of course, stereotyping, that's a different, it's related, but those are more about certain generalizations about a group or overgeneralizations that are based on maybe one encounter with a member of an out group and you generalize, or it's based on, absorbing it externally through conversations, ideas that are embedded and implanted into people's minds. So there's different things you can do to combat conspiracy theories. And I say this separately because when we look at contact theory, this is potentially not helpful. Because interaction and exposure alone doesn't necessarily change, like, okay, well, I think a Jewish person is X, Y, Z, just because oftentimes if a Jewish person or somebody acts in a contradictory way to the perception, that contradiction will just be worked into the conspiracy theory. Oh, this Jewish person's, let's take the trope, Jews own the economy, they're all rich and they have all the money, whatever the stereotype is. Well, I met a Jewish person who isn't so rich, they don't have a lot of money and they don't have a high paying job, but they're just there to throw the whole thing off. That's a decoy. They just don't represent because they're trying to throw everybody off on thinking that. It's just worked back into the conspiracy. So there are strategies that you can develop that target the underlying emotional social processes that lead to conspiracy thinking. Oh, some things you can do are prevention and harm reduction. This is Peter Krako, his work. So you can try to target the conspiracy theory information before people reach it. You can try to, I guess he calls it, immunize the population before they take on the theory. And so they're kind of almost resistant to it. And then you can work with the population after conspiracy theories then thread the targeted population in a healing process, or you can try to deprogram the people who received the conspiracy material and are prone to maybe believing it. And yeah, so it's a whole other group, and I'm not sure my strategies necessarily target that specifically. Education usually is not thought of as effective enough to target those underlying processes, and just like I said, because you present contradictory information to anybody who might have a bias or prejudice against an outgroup doesn't necessarily mean it will change the underlying values or emotions there. So then we get into intergroup relations, and this relates to people and how we process and categorize them. So social categorization is a common process that we use to categorize others into various groups: dangerous, safe, like me, not like me, etc. It's argued that sometimes prejudice is often influenced by perceived in-group threats, so out-group threats. So, that group is harmful to my group because X, Y, Z. Or this idea of fear. There's also ideas, relative deprivation, authoritarianism. These are personality theories and behavioral ideas that on how an in-group can perceive an out-group as, okay, well, maybe they have more than me, maybe this or that, so it builds resent amongst the in-group towards another group, or it builds animosity or negative emotions. And so strategies that target the emotional or social, again, pieces are really important. And so here comes contact theory, which according to social psychology and the research that it does exist on combating prejudice is perhaps the most effective way generally to fight hate. Has it really been tested in the context of anti-Semitism? Not so much that I have found. It's not to say it never has, but part of my work will look at, in the context of hatred against Jews, is this something that has been helpful in reducing prejudices or negative perceptions of Jews, and therefore maybe anti-Semitism, and why? So it's important, though, when creating the contact between two groups. So these would be strategies that bring communities together. And I'll get to some examples that I found in Ottawa of strategies that looked at contact, and when I interviewed the participants and they thought that, okay, well, yeah, it did help me understand Jewish people better. It did take my prejudice down. It did blah, blah, blah. So there are certain conditions that you do have to, and factors that you should include in a contact setting. It doesn't just happen spontaneously. And if you have perceived threat of the group that you, like if you see the group you're interacting with as a threatening group, for example, and the animosities haven't been dealt with, or the contact doesn't target those issues or put the group on equal footing, it can actually worsen the prejudice. So this is to be done intentionally and structured. Another thing that's really important is cross-group friendships. Cross-group friendships are basically, the idea is that if I am Jewish, or no, sorry, I'm just gonna make this up. If I am of group A, and I know someone in my in-group who is friends with a Jewish person, and it's a positive relationship and everything is good, it might make me more open to being friends or getting to know the Jewish person. And so it's this idea that developing positive impressions of groups can filter through friendships, and creating bonds of friendships in that level can also help people bring the people together and improve the social relations. And another thing that's important, because one of the problems as well when you work with groups and trying to bring them together in a bond is the idea of identity salience. So this is what you also want to target. It's the idea that if your ethnic or religious identity is what's so powerful and strong for you, and you're connecting your perceptions of the group you're communicating with based on that, that has a potential to heighten the prejudice, right? So the idea is to try to get people to, one is the common in-group identity model. So the idea is that people recategorize what their salient identity is based on similarities and not differences. So I'm making this up, but if I'm Jewish and I'm interacting with someone who's Muslim, and we're coming at it, with our own biases that our identity kind of informs, and those are our salient or prominent identities. The idea is that maybe we both have in common that we like yoga. There we go, from last again, that's true. I like yoga. So if we both start saying, okay, well, we're yoga practitioners, we're yogis, okay, well, what can we talk about for that? You start bringing, and then I find out, you go to this gym, well, I go to that gym, or I know someone that goes to that gym, I've heard X, Y, Z. And all of a sudden, these other identities or pieces of you start taking center stage, and the Jewish and Muslim identities come down. So various examples from Ottawa where you see this type of contact and programs that seemed to improve relations between Jews and non-Jews were experiential events. The experiential component was so important. It wasn't just about education or learning. There had to be a doing piece. So these could be interfaith or multi-faith Shabbat dinners. These could be holiday events. The bottom one's very small. So the next one would be charitable initiatives or organizations. So religious or ethnic communities coming together to work on a common charitable cause, such as housing or, feeding people. You can reorganize your shared identity. So this was really important, was that people came together and their identity was about working on affordable housing, not being Jewish or Muslim or Christian, even though they didn't eliminate those identities. And reducing ethnic and religious identity salience was important. And what's so important that contact does, it hopefully, if done properly, it will increase empathy towards the outgroup and reduce anxiety towards them, which target those fears and target those perceptions of threat about an outgroup that make us resistant sometimes to improving our social relations and forming prejudice. So just wanted to share one quote. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. This was from one of my participants in Ottawa, and the first part isn't about Jewish people, it's about Christian-Muslim relations, but I think it's really a really good example to highlight when these kinds of mediated contact efforts between groups are put forth, they can have positive results. So you can read it, but basically at this housing complex where religious communities come together to help people who are low income and need social housing. They create a community room, and they have religious holiday events where communities can put on their event, and all the residents are welcome to come and participate and learn about that religious holiday or that community. So here it was around Christmas. They had, I guess some of the tenants wanted to put on a nativity play, so the birth of Jesus. And they had some of the Muslim children, some of whom were wearing hijabs, participating in the play. And the participant, which is so interesting, she says, you usually don't see children from a Muslim family participating in a Christian play, or maybe even vice versa, if it was there was some kind of programming for the Muslim community. And she said all the parents loved it, and everyone was laughing, and they out of camaraderie, not laughing at them, but they just thought it was so great. And she says they've also had a Passover Seder, which is like a special ritual meal during the holiday of Passover for Jews. And there were Muslims and Jews and Christians all attending, participating, asking questions, being polite and learning and observing and experiencing what a Seder entails. And she thought that, what they were doing was working, because where would you see such camaraderie amongst religious communities where there's so much conflict or prejudice or separation? And here you have them interacting and even participating in other religious rituals that don't necessarily follow their own traditions. But then she mentions that they have commonalities, and people were noting commonalities, and that they were starting to see that, okay, well, maybe that's not so different from me. And it was all because they were involved in this mediated, intentional contact situation with each other. And that is an example of contact theory and anti-Semitism. Yeah.
Thank you. 20-minute thing is exciting but hard, eh? And so now maybe you switch over a little bit so the camera can actually
Join that chair there. Sure.
Yeah.
Looks like a nice chair.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we enter the next phase of the afternoon, where I have an opportunity to just be the moderating influence between the two of you. So Jordan, you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Certainly my sense is that questions around rising anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism are of much discussion in the Jewish community here in Victoria. So I think you'll find opportunity to interview folks and build out your case study here. I guess I want to start with a couple of questions. I'll do them one at a time. Where there's, I guess, a sense of dissonance. I feel a sense of dissonance between the way in which maybe I perceive or think about these things and the approaches that you're taking. So one is that I think in these audits of anti-Semitism, the recent audits of anti-Semitism, the overwhelming majority of the instances and the source of the rise in anti-Semitism is online.
Yeah.
Right. So when I think of discussions around the new anti-Semitism, or when I look at some of the examples that you provided, they're not at all kitchen table type settings. They're mass, sometimes anonymous interactions. So I wonder, so your approach feels sort of, comfortingly old-fashioned to me, at least, so, but can you speak to, the types of approaches that you're engaging speak to an environment where these acts of hate are overwhelmingly digital, and how do you think around that?
I think in that case, the first thing that comes to my mind is hopefully if you start broadening these solutions and people have these experiences where they can create empathy towards other groups, understanding friendship, whatever relations in a positive manner, I think the idea is that it would help them have the ability cognitively to know that something online is wrong, or to feel bad about participating in it or to not participate. So I think in that sense, it's more of a preventative, or like I mentioned, maybe an immunization, so that when people go into online spaces. Now, one of my subjects did note that they wanted, it was an organization in Canada that works on anti-Semitism, but they wanted to note that, we need an online literacy campaign, because it isn't just about inoculating people against, anti-Semitism, or if I have Jewish friends and they mean something to me, well, that seems wrong. If I understand who they are and I can experience that, but it's not even just about the knowledge that those accusations, tropes, that rhetoric is wrong. It's the empathy piece, right? Or the reduced threat or group anxiety, then maybe I would be more willing to spot that, or I'd be more immunized. So, okay, that's not right. But the problem is a lot of people just in general I think there's a lack of online skills and how to understand misinformation on the internet generally. And so their suggestion was to have an online literacy campaign, an internet literacy campaign more broadly. The example they compared it to was when cannabis was legalized, and there was a big campaign to educate people on the dangers and risks of using cannabis and how to use it responsibly, etc. He said something modeled off of that.
I guess I just wonder, I mean, isn't there a sort of a disconnect between comportment that we observe online versus comportment that we would expect in our normal social lives? So you and I conversing about this here, we would expect a pretty different mode of interaction than we might see about this online, right? And so is it its own beast in a way?
I don't know if it is. One thing that I've argued before is that, so one thing that is true is the internet is changing how we process information, how we perceive information, gather information, and how we disseminate it. And I wonder if it's because the cues that you are using socially online are not necessarily the same as the cues you would use in a person-to-person conversation, like in person. And so I've always wondered, and I don't think we can answer this yet, but the question becomes is how, if it's normalized that you can be anonymous online as a start, and then you can kind of spew whatever you want about anybody. Is that normalizing how we understand conversation and relating to people and what's polite or socially acceptable offline? Like, I'm wondering if because our social norms are changing in this space, is changing them outside that space.
Do you think
it's hard to measure that, but
do you think the approaches that you're advocating where people undertake projects together or have these forms of structured interactions with each other, do you see prospect for undertaking and researching digital aura of that kind?
do you mean like how to impact social interaction online?
Or rather than envisioning that people will gather in person in order to address what's substantially a digital, perhaps substantially an online problem.
Or you could even do like a third site. So, Montreal, Ottawa, Victoria, and the internet.
So yeah, but the internet would have been that's a whole other project.
Or maybe that's a post office.
Yeah, there you
But
go.
is that the place where the hate is?
I think largely, although a lot of the incidents that get reported are still graffiti and vandalism, there's still harassment, there's not so much, thank goodness, but violence to a point. I mean, that's much lower, but that still exists. And so there's still a lot going on outside, and a lot, it's very known that, whatever gets reported is probably not everything that's happened. A lot of people don't report the incidents that happen to them, and most of what gets reported doesn't end up being charged as criminal. And most of what's charged as criminal people don't get charged as, with hate crimes or convicted as guilty. And so I think there's enough going on the outside that this could help. I'm hoping that affecting social relations on the outside will help people understand what might be appropriate materially, not online, but you could probably do a further study on the internet and see if there's alternative strategies. I don't think I've come across much in the literature that actually answers that question. So I don't know if it's even territory that we've even explored yet.
So the second dissonance is completely different. I'm used to thinking around and hearing discussions of racism, if we can put this in that area, that are largely structural, right? That have turned away from concern with people's thoughts and beliefs, and instead look towards the ways within institutions, people who all think of themselves as not feeling hate towards a particular group, nonetheless reproduce patterns of exclusion, patterns of marginalization. But this study is oriented seemingly exclusively towards people's attitudes and beliefs. So I wonder, do Jews face a structural issue? Is there a structural issue? And if not, or whatever the answer to that, I guess, how does this type of analysis relate to or fit into those discussions of prejudice that aren't primarily oriented toward, or those discussions of inequality and marginalization that are not focused on attitudes and in fact kind of eschew that concern?
They face a structural issue. I don't know. I think the reason I look at communities and on the groundwork is because a lot of the anti-Semitism we see today comes from on the ground. It's not so much institutional or organizational anymore. I mean, it was at one point more so. I mean, it's discrimination in Jews not being able to have certain jobs, get into certain educational institutions or programs, or there were quotas. I'm just talking about here in Canada, but, or at least in Canada. I can't say there's no employer who doesn't have an anti-Jewish bias. I'm sure that is true, but I don't know. But it's funny because Jews, maybe more your second point, Jews occupy a weird space where, and I think this sometimes works against them in the sense of people kind of turn them into part of the, white privileged class or group. Because there are many Jews, of Ashkenazi descent who are diaspora population. Ashkenazi Jews, if there's people in the audience, those are Jews that live in the Central and Eastern European, or from the Central and Eastern European diaspora. So they are paler in skin color, so they present as white. That doesn't mean that there's reduced hatred towards Jews, and Jews are not accepted by, in white supremacist circles, for example. So they don't really fit in the really radical forms of that narrative. But then on the other side, they also fit because through restrictions lifting and a normalization of Jews working in different, employment sectors and stuff, socioeconomically, they do not completely, but many do very well. And so I think they kind of you wouldn't think there's a structural issue, but I think there's more of a social structural issue. Maybe then like if we still see an increase in incidents, but you have these factors that should usually reduce the prejudice or mean Jews belong to a majority, socioeconomically, maybe physical appearance wise, but they're still not in a lot of spaces and accepted by a lot of people, then to me, there's a different issue, maybe.
I think we only have a couple minutes left before my 20 minutes of interaction are up. So I have two questions I wish I could ask, but I'm only going to ask one. The one I'm not going to ask is around, just in case it's seeds for anybody else.
This is not actually happening.
Is around efficacy, what it means, and how it fits into your study. What does it mean to be effective? But the question I do want to ask is one that you said you explicitly didn't want to address, which has to do with the definition of anti-Semitism.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't want to ask you to define anti-Semitism, so I think that's what you were trying to avoid doing. But I wonder is that move really possible in a discussion of anti-Semitism today? Can you really say anti-Semitism, might be defined lots of different ways? I'm going to set that aside, and I just want to talk about anti-Semitism. But is that, especially where the definition of anti-Semitism is, the reason you don't want to talk about it is because it's very politicized and divisive, and it there are organized initiatives around the definition of anti-Semitism. So in that context, can you really proceed to study anti-Semitism and bracket the definitional problem?
No, in my it's in my literature review, that's where it'll be, but I take in my
Tucked away safely.
parts that no one wants to read. I do tackle the kind of academic debate on the definition. There's some people who think we need to do away with the definition of the word anti-Semitism because of the context in which it formed, which was very specific, and it's become a very generalized term, almost like religion, right? I've compared that before. I made that comparison before in other work, and there's other people though, but generally speaking, people call anti-Jewish hate of whatever form, historically, now, whatever, and whenever, anti-Semitism. That's what's happened. And so it becomes a term that you kind of almost have to use. But then the problem is, well, is that really a helpful term? I think there are many definitions about it. So I can't really say if we can sidestep the idea of definition. I think talking about the conversations around it's important. I don't think I can make a value judgment because I don't know if I have one.
But for instance, the claim that anti-Semitism is rising relies in part on definitions used in recent audits of anti-Semitism. So even the kind of motivating energy of the whole study is rooted in a particular
So
current definition of anti-Semitism by certain
the one that you're
organizations.
talking about is the IRA or IHRA definition. Everyone can look it up. It's been very, very, very controversial, both with people who might support some of the stuff in it and people who do not support some of the definitional examples of anti-Semitism in it. That's the one that gets used. It's a working definition. I think there's parts a lot of people agree or disagree with it. Though I will say it all comes back. You can say, you can think, okay, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? Where does anti-Israel criticism become anti-Semitic? All you want. I don't know if you'd ever reach a definitive answer. You never reach one that pleased everybody ever. I can guarantee that. But I think what's really important is this conversation that comes up in this question of who gets to define. Because if it's the community that's being targeted, as we've, and there's a lot of disagreement within the Jewish community about where the lines are drawn with those definitions and issues. But then it becomes about, so when, the audits use the definition, and I believe they use the IRA definition, it becomes about a community using a definition that they think fits the prejudice that they're experiencing. And should they be allowed to self-define prejudice against their own community? That I think becomes the question, right? Because if you say yes, then certain definitions might not work, and then other definitions might work, and then you can have a more focused idea of what counts as hate and how do we classify it. But even still, there's still disagreement in the Jewish community about the IRA definition. Yeah. So it's really hard to say, but I think it goes back to who gets to define. It's even B'nai B'rith deciding that, that's their idea of what counts as anti-Semitism, but you might have someone that could disagree, you might have someone that agrees.
So I think we could continue on the definition question for quite a while, but actually we have now an opportunity to broaden the conversation a little bit, to bring in folks in the room and people on Zoom as well. For those of you who are going to be at the Center Coffee tomorrow, where we always do a debrief of whatever happens on a Thursday night, maybe I would ask you to defer to other folks in the room who aren't going to be there. And same thing with the Zoom cohort. But thanks for that, Megan, that was great. So Scott, is there anybody from Zoom, Rach or Scott, that we want to bring in as a first question asker?
I mean, I have a question. So Lauren Strumos, who we all love and adore, has a question. So Lauren is wondering if there's a gender dimension to your research, or if you expect to find one in the data.
Oh, that's a really good question. I did not expect that kind of a question. Thank you, Lauren. I haven't really taken that angle, so I haven't noticed, but actually just off the top of my head, thinking of the people I've interviewed thus far, I don't think there's necessarily a gender dimension that's become relevant. It really focuses on religious and ethnic identities, and those inform people's interactions in these spaces, maybe more so. This is not part of the research, but I think having, in my past or participated in events that were multi-faith or communities coming together, I don't know if there's gendered aspects. I think where you might find a gendered aspect is if you have maybe someone who's observant as a Jewish person, like a Jewish woman, and they cover a certain way, or where, the head covering, or you have like a Muslim woman who wears a hijab or veils. That might be where you find limitations in space, maybe, or opportunity. I don't know, but I haven't really seen it yet.
But I don't know if Lauren wrote anything else, but I wonder if one of the things she might mean, in addition to a Jewish woman's experience, would it be different? But the other thing is, are you finding or sensing that the people who express these anti-Semitic feelings are more likely to be men? I wonder if that's another way to think of it. It's a gender phenomenon.
I don't think so. The people I interview aren't necessarily anti-Semites or people that had prejudices. They could have been people that had ideas in their head and preconceived notions. I haven't met anybody yet that went so far as it was hate people or maybe full out prejudice, but no, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think people really just focus on religious and ethnic identities more than gender, and that's been the salience in that situation.
But I guess what I mean is more like, are the people who are doing the nasty things mostly men? Is that the imagined?
More to Jordan's point, a lot of it, especially the online stuff's anonymous. I have no idea.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
Except the Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I don't judge. Who knows? That could be somebody else altogether.
But also, I wonder in the social psychology, like research and in contact theory and stuff, I'm sure, I'm wondering if there's gender dynamics that have been present there in the sense of, so contact theory is really well known. And so has there been studies on our male identifying people versus female identifying people more willing to change their biases or prejudices? Is there kind of a gender dynamic in that sense, perhaps? And I'll tag onto this as well. Lauren had a secondary question because I think in the way that you're responding, you're focusing in on religion, faith, all these sorts of terms. So she's also wondering how religion and non-religion or secularity kind of appears in these arenas as well. So do distinctions among religion, culture, ethnicity, secularity become relevant in your research as well?
That's a good question. Yes and no. I think a lot of the participants that were participating in organizations that did this kind of work or programming or events, it started from a place of religion, and religion became important as like in people self-identifying, like how they self-identified. But as they got into their work or as they get into what they do, the religion piece sort of takes a back seat. And I don't want to say it becomes secular, but people's conversations shift more to what they're doing. But sometimes what they're doing comes from a religious, well, they would describe it as a religious motivation. So like when you look at religious communities that come together to work on form an organization that helps people find affordable housing, and they have several housing complexes that tenants rent in. To be a member of that organization, you have to be a congregation or a faith-based organization. And the work becomes about this broader social issue that touches all communities. But the motivation to do it was because it was important to your religious community, or it was a religious value to help those in need, was basically the idea. Or you have other charitable organizations that just provide general social services to people. It becomes important, but less so. As people, of certain religious backgrounds, or they're from like a Jewish organization and they help people of diverse communities, ethnically and religiously, it becomes about providing that social service or providing that programming to those communities. And the identity salience is important, so religiously and ethnically, for example, but I think in the end it becomes about the shared humanity or goal.
Lynn?
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. I just wanted to go back to the gender piece, and this comes out of some of my own work, where I think at least among feminists, particularly in the 60s and 70s, when there was, but even still today, where there was a lot of animus towards religion as patriarchal, there could sometimes be an edge or beyond an edge of anti-Semitism in that, because say Jewish women who wanted to be culturally Jewish and have feminist seders and so forth could be denounced as, accepting patriarchy, and Christians, because they were secular, so they were unmarked, they didn't. So I think there are, that's just one example, but I do think there are some interesting gender dimensions of some of these issues. But that may not be the focus of what you're doing, but just
thank you for that. That's a very interesting point that I hadn't considered. No, that hasn't, I don't think the gender piece has been as prominent in this research as, maybe in other fields of research or in other projects. It hasn't really been something that people have focused on, or it's been a challenge or an impediment to working with other communities or building bridges. Yeah, I don't know if it might come up here, it might come up in Montreal, but in Ottawa it was not that prominent.
Yeah, we have another question from the Zoom audience, so from Farley Cates. To what extent do strategies need to be differentiated within various arenas? So, for example, within the entertainment industry, the educational system, political system, do these strategies need to be differentiated depending on the context?
Yeah, absolutely. And the literature agrees. I think the strategies really have to be targeted to the particular communities that are coming together, the kind of space that they're in, what the goals of the contact are, the preconceived notions and assumptions from one group to the other. And I think why it has to be contextually different. And this is why I said in the beginning, we need a toolkit of strategies. I think I don't think it's a one size fits all problem, like the solution, sorry. And I think because you have common tropes or stereotypes or themes or accusations that play out, but the thing with anti-Semitism is it can take a mask depending on who's promoting the hate, where it's being promoted, when it's being promoted. And so you need to kind of work with different sectors, industries, social groups to figure out how these strategies can be tailored to work with their particular communities or population, because anti-Semitism is customizable, very much so.
Paige?
Hello, thanks for that. I want to sort of push you on the gender thing also a little bit. I'm just thinking about, so if you're speaking to people in this project about their prejudice or those common kind of tropes that are out there, the really sort of, anti-Jewish hate stuff, like Jews run the world or the media or the banks, I suspect that they're thinking almost exclusively about Jewish men. And if you look at sort of anti-Jewish propaganda in Nazi Germany, those drawings, those renderings of Jews were often male. And so I'd be curious when people do have those stereotypes, to maybe ask them, like, who are you picturing? Are you picturing Jewish men? Are you picturing Jewish women?
That's
Just something to
actually, yeah, thank you. That's a really good consideration. You raise a good point. Because people, I mean, I was letting people kind of bring up the issues that were important to them. And then, yeah, like I said, like that really wasn't a prominent concern for people. But if you look maybe on the online spaces, I mean, the artwork that has existed historically, the Nazi propaganda of memes and cartoons now on the internet, it does largely center around men. There's some female aspects.
I think sometimes people don't
diverse,
think about
but-
it until you ask them to think about it.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing you mentioned though about the gender thing. I mean, there was, this idea, I don't know to what extent how pervasive it was, but there was an idea that had some resonance with people back, in the Middle Ages, for example, this idea that Jewish men had breasts and menstruated because I don't know. Why not? Because they're the devil, they're this, they're that.
Well, it's similar to the sort of,
they're bent.
the kind of anti-Chinese
Different
stuff where
dimensions, yeah.
Chinese men were really sort of depicted as very
Yeah.
feminized.
Andre?
Well, I just had actually a follow-up from that question. I was thinking of medieval anti-Semitism and how, of course, we're all familiar with the persistence and the strange, terrible revival of the blood libel as a theme, and even in modern conspiracy theories. But what you often see in a lot of those medieval legends is the Jewish man being stubborn and denying Christ and torturing Christ and stabbing the consecrated wafer and doing that stuff. But the wife, the woman being converted, remonstrating with him, that kind of thing. So it seems like a gendered prejudice. And today, this notion of George Soros.
I'm wondering if it reflects broader social ideas about gender and gender stereotypes that just seep into, I mean, if people are not well versed in who Jews really are, I'm assuming they're probably not going to take a lot of time. I mean, it doesn't say that people who are in certain feminist circles or certain gender study circles are not harboring some kind of anti-Jewish prejudice either in some way. It's not, about being ignorant and, in a patriarchal context, but I think it can come up. I think when you talk about those examples, yes.
And we're drawing you towards a really dark place, and and we've talked about the internet, and you're trying to move towards the light of good people, goodwill, working together, and that I guess we're also pessimistic about that right now.
No, but it's a continuum of hate, right? It exists now because it existed then. So I think.
But I wonder if maybe you could speak to, I know one of the themes that Lori works on is that we focus a lot on the very
Yes,
violent,
yes.
very public, very legal, very political, very formal public
And we do,
controversies.
yeah.
And I think one thing I appreciate about her work, and what I also see is behind some of what you're doing, is an interest in, actually, are there other ways that things work out sometimes? So you're not necessarily sleuthing anti-Semitism, you're trying to understand alternative ways of approaching this
Because
phenomenon.
I think that I truly think that there are things out there that could work given the proper resources, platforms, attention, and time. I just think that we don't know that yet, or we haven't uncovered that yet. So it's part of what I'm doing. I was just thinking of Lori's work, and I agree. And I think, I don't know if it's like this in other studies. I think a lot of times someone who's in Jewish studies and who identifies as Jewish, so I'm not saying this in an insulting way, I think a lot of times when you recount Jewish history, or I teach about the Holocaust, right? Like, it's very common that we focus on the negative episodes, or the episodes of persecution in the Jewish community, but I think sometimes even we don't focus on the moments that we've had, positive times, or maybe weren't treated so badly, or weren't, the persecution wasn't as harsh and we could fare better or have some kind of mobility in society. So I think, and maybe other communities do that, I don't know, when they focus on their own stories. I think it's just a human thing, maybe not completely, but generally, to focus on the negativity and not the positive aspects. And maybe we do need to start shifting our focus to what can work, or could work, or has worked.
And maybe if that, given your approach and that the hardcore anti-Semites aren't
Yeah,
showing
yeah.
up to the dinner parties or to your interviews and so on, then maybe in a way that's a false leading, maybe that's not your start in a sense, the rising phenomenon of anti-Semitism, the audits largely online. Maybe instead it's a different kind of story about the possibilities of intercultural interaction that maybe don't address a 50% rise in online hate over the last 3 years or whatever, and are just operating in a different environment.
As many times as much as there have been anti-Semites in history, or people who hate Jews, or hate other groups, there are people that didn't. And there are people that helped, or were allies, or supported, and we really don't hear about them so much. I mean, you do, when you do, learn about the Holocaust, you do hear about righteous Gentiles to a certain extent, but even still, it becomes like this part of the story, but we focus so much on the killing and the persecution and the propaganda. And, I think that there are stories of positive interaction that have worked. The research shows that works to a large extent. I want to see, and because my study is qualitative, I want to see, okay, well, let's do it in the context of anti-Semitism, and the qualitative piece is what's underlying why it might work. Like, why do people think this has worked for them? And what's going on? What are those values? What are those morals? What are the, I'll call them morals, but what are those assumptions that drive them to do that kind of work? And are there ways or strategies that can help start fostering that in other people? And again, you're not going to, the hardcore people are just kind of lost causes, I think, at this point.
Rachel, is there,
Maybe not.
is there any other Zoom questions? Sorry, Meg, I know you might be there tomorrow. I'm not gonna be here tomorrow, so.
Yeah, it's gonna take us back into another kind of intersectional lens on this, and potentially, not so much
And we
the
don't have-
positive side of things.
We don't have much time.
Yeah, so the question is from Marina, and she wants to know, how racial dimensions fit into this. So for white presenting Jewish individuals versus Jewish communities that may be not white presenting or racialized, is there a dimension there that impacts?
That's a great,
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
question.
Well, I think when you have those intersectional identities, and you have somebody who might be a Jewish person of color, whether they're Sephardic, so their skin is maybe more like a tan color, maybe they're a Black Jew. Yeah, they can be targeted for being, a person of color, so more on the racial characteristics. I think if they're targeted, or they're known to be Jewish, that can absolutely be targeted as just being Jewish. I think obviously Ashkenazi Jews faces serious amount of hate as well. What sometimes makes them maybe more of a target for the in-person hate, or especially the physical, like the violent kind, is if they're visibly Jewish, they're more of an obvious target. So if they're wearing like religious garb, and sometimes that's where the religious intersects with the just being Jewish, right? Thing. No, and in my personal experience, I think I have to watch because I want to say what I think and I've anecdotally experienced, but I also want to kind of say what makes more empirical sense. In my experience, for when I read the examples and then when I know personally, I think once it doesn't necessarily matter if you present as white on the outside and people don't know you're Jewish or not. Once your Jewish identity is revealed, you absolutely are opened as a target, or can be, depending on who the person is you're dealing with. Because there's so many things about Jewish people that are targeted, right? That have nothing to do with skin color. So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Well, this is really helpful. So several of you around the table are going to be there at coffee tomorrow to tease out some of these questions that we couldn't really get into in much depth today, but I really appreciate you being here and sharing your research with us. And those of you who are online and who are sad that you don't get to be with us tomorrow, you should become fellows of the center and then you can be with us every Friday.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for being here. Join us next week for John Nelson, who's from the University of San Francisco. He's with us for some months to talk about adventures with religion in contemporary Asia. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good week.